very good afternoon to one and all present here. I hope you are doing well and staying safe. My name is Jaya Mishra, and I, on behalf of team of Bharatiya Nyaya Shastram and Lawyers Gyan, welcome you all to today's webinar. Let me tell you all that today's webinar is being conducted by Bharatiya Nyaya Shastram in collaboration with Lawyers Gyan. So coming back to the topic for today's webinar is witnesses and their examination and overview. Today's topic is of utmost importance for all the law students and lawyers out here because examination of witnesses plays a key role in presentation of evidence in the court of law regardless of the character of the case, whether it is civil or criminal. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to the guest of honor for today, Advocate Rajiv Joshi, sir. Sir, it gives us immense pleasure and honor to introduce you. Sir is currently a practicing advocate of Punjab and Haryana High Court. And now talking further about Sir's educational qualification, Sir has completed his graduation in BA Honours from SD Government College, Ludhiana. Sir was ranked first in his whole batch, which is a clear-cut example of his academic excellence. Sir completed his law degree from Punjab University, Chandigarh. Now, if we have looked at Sir's practicing career till now, because it has been 18 years since he has been practicing, it has been quite progressive, successful, and inspirational. Sir started his practicing career from Sessions Court Jalandhar, where he learned the basics of civil and criminal trial. Then, Sir moved to High Court of Chandigarh and started his practice under the supervision of Miss Lisa Gill, who has since been elevated as Judge of Punjab and Haryana High Court. Sir, during his practicing career, has contested various important cases on civil matters, criminal matters, consumer matters, corporate matters, and there are many more. Sir, during his practicing career, has contested some important cases like fake BT cotton case, where Sir represented the farmers of Punjab in front of State Consumer Dispute Redressal Forum. Sir has also contested and won various cases against various corporate giants like Jet Airways and ICICI Lombard. Sir, Sir has also been Sir has also been appointed by Punjab State Government and training of newly recruited PCS, where Sir imparted knowledge on base CRPC and CPC. Besides having such a successful career and achieving such heights in his legal practicing field, Sir's keen interest in academics cannot go unnoticed. And it is very much evident from his active participation in various debates, in various declamations. Sir has also been active part of various webinars. Sir has keen interest in writing articles, and let me tell you all that Sir's articles, many of his articles have been published even in various newspapers like Tribune. Sir has also keen interest in teaching. Sir has also been invited by various renowned universities like BHU and Lovely Profession University and others for delivering guest lectures. These were some of the list of Sir's accomplishments, and the list is never ending. Whole journey of Sir is a clear-cut example of hard work, dedication, and determination, and speaks only one thing, that hard work is the key to success. Now, I would like to request to the audience that if you have any questions during the session, kindly type your questions in the comment box, and I will make sure that I bring them up at the end of the session. Now, without wasting much of the time, I would like to request Sir to kindly enlighten and highlight today's topic. Sir, please.
Thank you so much, Jaya. Thank you, Bharatiya Nyaya Shastram, for inviting me at this forum. Before we start with today's topic about the witnesses and the examination of the trials, let us just have a brief thought as to how important it is for the trial courts to examine the witnesses and how important is the bearing of the questions that are put to these witnesses at the trial and how important these would be at the end of the trial and how these have material bearing upon various questions, aspects before the appellate courts. Witnesses, as Bentham says, are eyes and ears of justice. So that sums it all. Witnesses are the one who will reveal to the court the truth of the matter. They will attempt to reveal to the court, and the court will dissect every case on the basis of the appreciation of the evidence which is brought on the record through witnesses. Now, Indian Evidence Act has laid down various principles as to the witnesses and their examination, most of which are covered in chapter 9 and 10. We would be discussing various provisions of the Indian Evidence Act which are covering those chapters. And these are the provisions which are usually dealt with by the legal practitioners while they are handling the trials. So, my today's session with all of you is not kind of an educational or an academic session as it might appear to be in the course, but my intention here would be to sensitize most of the law students, the lawyers, and other people interested to delve a little deeper into the questions which Indian Evidence Act actually answers. If we go through the provisions of the sections, you'll probably might get bored and even may not understand the true implication of the section by having a cursory look at it. But if you will see various case laws, various situations which happen in the courtrooms, and how the judges are called upon to decide and adjudicate an important objection taken by the opposition, by the defense, or by the prosecution, the court is mostly guided by these sections. And even your questions, even while if you are watching a Bollywood movie or a Hollywood movie which has a courtroom scene, would be most probably be answered from these very provisions of law. So let us start from section 118, which says who may testify. I will today give you brief questions which will actually have answers from these very provisions of Evidence Act. And these questions, if you write down these questions, you will understand the provisions of Indian Evidence Act. You will be able to appreciate them in a much more effective way than if you were to read them just in a casual manner or just as it was. So section 118 says, who may testify? Is a lunatic competent to testify? That's a question which 118 poses. And 118 says, yes, all persons shall be competent to testify unless the court considers that they are prevented from understanding the questions put to them. So here, even a lunatic is not incompetent to testify unless his lunacy will prevent him from understanding the questions put to him. Then 119 talks about, can a witness depose if he is unable to communicate verbally? Because most of us understand that it's an oral evidence. Most of us understand that. Of course, the practicing lawyers are aware of the amendment in the procedural laws, especially the CPC, wherein now the examination in chief is allowed to be made by way of an affidavit. But most of us understand that an evidence of a witness is recorded in the shape of a oral evidence. He says something and then you write it down, record it. But yes, 119 does make a provision for a person who's not able to communicate verbally. So the next question is, if a witness can depose, even if he's unable to communicate verbally, then how? By writing The answer is by writing or by signs. The next question under 190. Is there any special rule which allows such a statement to be videographed? Yes, 119 provides for that. So then we come to section 120. It says, can the parties have their husbands or wives or a husband or wife appear as witnesses in the civil or criminal proceedings? Can you file a civil suit and have your husband as one of the witnesses? Or if the husband is facing a criminal prosecution, can the wife come in? She can step in the defense as a defense witness? Yes. In civil and criminal proceedings, both husband or a wife is a competent witness. Simple. Now, the provisions of 121 to 131 is something that we would say are covered under privileges. And kindly note that these things, these provisions 121 to 131. I'll tell you at the end of the session why. Now the question under 121. Can a judge or a magistrate be compelled to answer a question as to his own conduct in the court? Can you question a judge about his conduct in the court? Ordinarily, no. With the special order of a superior court, yes. Next question. Can he be compelled to answer a question as to anything which came to his knowledge in court? Can he be compelled to? Again, the answer is no, but yes, exception is there with the special permission of the court to which he is subordinate. The third question under 121. So can he not be examined at all? Can you not examine a magistrate in any case? Yes, he may be examined as to matters which happened in his presence. Now here I'll pause for a moment. I'll speak about something that happened in the courts at Mohali, I guess. There was a witness. There was a man who decided one fine day that he has had enough, and he will now go before any court, before any judge, and commit suicide. Nobody knew that he is having such an intention. So he wrote a suicide note, a long letter, that he had been harassed by 1, 2, 3, 4, like so many people. And he goes before a magistrate, hands him over a letter, and consumes poison, immediately dies. This is an event which has happened before a magistrate in his own courtroom. Witness to this entire event has been handed over to him. So in that eventuality, he can be examined with respect to what has happened in front of him. 122. Can a person be compelled to disclose any communication made to him during marriage by any person to whom he has been married? This is called the privilege of the marriage. Any communication made during the subsistence of a marriage. Now, is there any exception? Yes. There are two exceptions. One is consent. You can of course give a consent, yes. And second exception is the suits between the married persons. Now you'll often find in the proceedings under Hindu Marriage Act, section 13, or even under the Indian Divorce Act, allegations and counter allegations by husband and wife that he used to do this, she used to do this, and this constituted mental harassment. Even minute details of their married life are often found in black and white, and maybe even beyond in those kind of litigations. That is an exception. But otherwise, apart from consent, nobody can be compelled to. So 123. Can a person give evidence of anything derived from, now note the words, anything derived from unpublished official records relating to the affairs of the state. Can a person give evidence of anything derived from, in inverted commas, unpublished official records? No. What are published official records? The published official records are like, maybe say, the Government Gazette, any government notification which has been published in the official gazettes. So something which has not been published. Can you give an information? Can you give an evidence of some fact which is derived from those papers? No, you cannot. Is there an exception? Yes. What is the exception? With the permission of the head of that department. So 123 is basically designed to prevent the leakage of the confidential documents from the custody of the state to the view of the general public. 124, the question: can a public officer be compelled to disclose communications made to him in official confidence? Now, you will often find that high-ranking officials are given some official communications, and over the top of that letter, it's written highly confidential, right? There's a note. Confidential means it is not supposed to be shared. But suppose there's a judicial proceeding and somebody steps into the witness box, he's a public officer, can he be compelled to disclose those communications made to him in official confidence? No. Is there any rider? The rider is, if he thinks that public interest will suffer, then he need not disclose them. There's a privilege this witness will be enjoying under section 124. 125. Can a magistrate or a police officer be compelled to disclose that when did he get information as to the commission of an offence? Can he? Or can a revenue officer in the similar circumstances be compelled to part with the knowledge that when he got the information of any offence against the public revenue? Again, the answer is no. So these are the privileges that these official persons have under the Indian Evidence Act. Then there's something called professional communications under section 126. The question: can a vakil, pleader, barrister, attorney be permitted, please note down the word be permitted, to disclose any communication made to him in the course of and for the purpose of his employment as vakil? The answer is no. I told you to underline the word permitted because this privilege under 126 is basically enjoyed by the clients of the advocates, attorneys, barristers. Now, what is the disclosure that is not to be made? The disclosure is as to the contents of any document which, for the purpose of his professional employment, he might have been able to gain knowledge of. Next question under 126. Are there any exceptions? Yes, there are two exceptions. The first one is illegal purpose. If the client intends to use any of those documents for illegal purpose, this privilege under 126 is not available to him. Then the pleader would be at liberty to disclose any communication made to him in this regard. Second one, fraud committed after the commencement of his employment. If there is a fraud committed after the commencement of the employment of the pleader, then it constitutes a second exception. The pleader can very well disclose any communication made to him during the course of his employment. I'll give an example. Suppose some client comes to an advocate and says, "Sir, I have committed a forgery and I wish you to defend me." Now he's admitted this fact. As the defense of the man known to be guilty is not a criminal purpose. He might have committed the offense, but the defense of a man known to be guilty, it's not a criminal purpose. The communication will be protected from disclosure. But if somebody comes to an attorney and says that I wish to obtain the possession of this property by the use of this forged deed on which I request you to sue, then it's an offense. Why? Because he's yet to commit the offense on the basis of a forged document after the employment has commenced. Now, there are various facets involved. What is the situation if the attention of the pleader was not drawn to such fact? Suppose the client gave me a file, I was reading through, I was flipping through that. My attention was never drawn towards a particular document, but I noticed it. Does the privilege under 126 extend to that document? The answer is immaterial. No. The answer is immaterial. I may have come to know about anything on my own. Second, what happens after the employment has ceased? What is the position? That I was an advocate and later on, maybe I was superseded, or maybe the prosecution has ended, the case which I was fighting has ended. The answer is the obligation continues. I can't disclose the communication made to me by my client during my engagement as an advocate to any third person. So the clients enjoy this privilege under 126. Now, the sections following 126 go an offshoot from here on. 127 would say, does section 126 apply to Munshi? So these are just the questions which have been framed by me. The exact language would say, does it apply to clerks, servants, or barristers? Yes, it applies to them also. 127 only says that. Now, 128, the question, is the privilege waived by volunteering the evidence? No. Somebody has volunteered an evidence. He wants you to come and give an evidence on his behalf for his side. Is that privilege under 126 waived? No, not yet. Next question, next section. Can a person be compelled to give evidence of any communication between him and his legal professional advisor? No. The answer is no. He cannot be. Now, next question. Can a witness who is not a party to the suit be compelled to produce his title deeds to any property? There is a witness. He's come to the witness box and he's not a party to the suit or proceeding. Suit is a civil suit, proceeding may be a criminal proceeding. He's not a party. can he be compelled to produce the title deeds or any other document which tend to criminate him? To criminate him means it will tend to attract some penalty or forfeiture for this man. No, he cannot be. This is a privilege which a witness will enjoy. He may not be compelled to produce his title deeds or any documents which might incriminate him. Going back to 129, when a pleader is called to the witness box, he would not be absolved under 128. He would not be absolved of the privilege which the client enjoys under 126 until he asks such a question. He's asked such a question which it would be absolutely compulsory, or the advocate or the pleader is at compulsion to disclose. उसने सवाल ही ऐसा पूछ लिया, has been asked, wherein he has no other alternative but to disclose that communication, and that too by his client while he is standing in the witness box. Then in those circumstances that privilege will stand absolved. 130 about the witness. But yes, there's one exception in 130. If a witness who has nothing to do with the suit or the proceeding, an option to decline to produce a document or any sale or any title deed, he thinks would criminate him. The next question is there any exception to this rule? There is only one exception. If the witness has voluntarily agreed, yes, I will produce it, then, and agreed in writing, then he will have to produce it because that would amount to waiver. I usually call 130 the privilege enjoyed by a witness under 130. आप उसको कुछ ऐसा बोल सकते हैं कि गेहूं के साथ घुन नहीं पिसेगा. Now 131 is something like कोई ना करे मैं भी ना करूं section. That someone else would be exempted. Can someone be compelled to produce documents in his possession which any other person would be entitled to refuse? If other people can be entitled to refuse, somebody be compelled to produce that document? Answer is no. Very well. Now 132. This is very important. Now, there are many instances in the trials where from a witness happens to be a guilty party. If the witness answers this question, it will criminate him. Shows that I will be charged with this question. Especially those who were a part of the conspiracy at some point of the time and exited that conspiracy right before the offense was committed. Situations. So 132 is a koi bahana nahi section. What is this koi bahana nahi section? It will kind of say that can a witness be excused from answering on the ground that answer would criminate him? The witness cannot. He will have to answer the question, but then there's a proviso attached here. It says that no such answer which a witness shall be compelled to give shall subject him to any arrest or prosecution or be proved against him in any criminal proceeding accept a prosecution for giving false evidence by such answer. 132, Section 132 existed for about 68 long years in the Indian Evidence Act, all by itself alone. And it was only after the introduction or the after the independent India, the Constitution of India came to be adopted in 1950, that Article 20, Subclause 2 was introduced, which says that nobody shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. That provision has kind of supplemented this provision, the proviso provided here in under 132. So on the one hand, 132 says it's a koi bahana nahi chalega section, that anybody who steps into the witness box is asked any question, the answer of which tends to criminate that person, that will not be an excuse for that person to not disclose that fact to the court. The proviso says that provided that witness, when a witness is compelled to give the answer, he shall not be arrested or prosecuted, except a prosecution for a false evidence by such answer. This you will find in many other provisions. In many other provisions, you will find the similar line, except for a prosecution. Evidence Act, Indian Evidence Act, really reserves a lot of contempt for those witnesses who would give a false statement at the trials. It really frowns upon such witnesses. Usually, Indian Evidence Act has been made as simple as possible to be able to guide the courts and the presiding officers to conduct the trials in a very fair manner without prejudicing anyone, either the accused or the prosecution, balancing the scales in a very balanced way. And at the same time, you will also see there is an attempt to prevent the diversion or going tangent to the issue of the main trial itself, because some of the witnesses will come statements which can be easily contradicted by the defense counsels, but they are not permitted to do so under the further provisions which we will just discuss now. 133. Is accomplice a competent witness? Now this is a very complicated thing, but not that complicated. Is accomplice a competent witness? Number one. Number two, 133 says, yes, he is. But 114 illustration B says that an accomplice is not worthy of credit. There seems to be an apparent conflict between both these provisions of law, but actually there is none. 133 is a rule of law, and 114 illustration B lays down a rule of prudence. What is the rule of law? The rule of law is that if a witness appears and he is an accomplice, the court can convict on the basis of the statement, the uncorroborated statement of an accomplice. However, what is the rule of prudence? The rule of prudence is that ordinarily the courts will stay their hands off from believing the statements of these accomplices who were a party, a guilty party to the entire transaction, but have somehow now the liberal construction of the code of the provisions as section 307 of CRPC, that is, they have been granted pardon, he's been allowed to be an approver of the case, right? So as a matter of prudence, the court will be slightly hesitant to convict somebody solely on the testimony of an accomplice. Rightly said in one of the judgments by Punjab and Haryana High Court that he is an unworthy friend. He is the most unworthy friend. Unworthy friend because he has purchased his freedom in lieu of somebody else's conviction. He will land somebody in jail. He's uh, he's a traitor who has betrayed his friends. So, coming to 134, if you all remember the famous dialogue in that movie Sholay, कितने आदमी थे? How many witnesses are required? 134 only answers that question and answers in a very simple way, no particular number. A solitary witness is enough. Quality rather than quantity. There is no number of witnesses that any case will be deemed to be compulsory in proving any kind of a matter before the Indian courts. Now, we have dealt with the questions competent, whether a lunatic is competent. We've dealt with what about a person who can't speak? Privileges 121 to 131. The privileges with the clients, the privileges with the lawyers, the privileges with the those connected with their servants, and a witness who's not a party. Now we come to the witnesses and their examination, the most of the Indian Evidence Act, and I assure you, the most fought for provisions in the criminal trials and the civil trials, especially in the criminal trials, who are considered belligerent at the trial courts will actually fight for their clients' rights, and they will derive all the armory and the arrows from this chapter. So, Section 135 opens Chapter 10 of the Indian Evidence Act says that how witnesses are to be produced and in what order. Very simple. The Evidence Act only says that witnesses are only to come in the as regulated by the law. On the civil side, by the procedure of civil code, and on the criminal side, by the procedure of by the criminal procedure code. So, how the witnesses, in what order the witnesses are to be examined, this will be guided by the procedural laws. Let us go to 136. The question which I have framed to explain this section is, who decides the admissibility of the evidence? Who decides? Of course, it's the judge. There are two important angles or sides to this provision. One is, if a fact proposed to be proved is one. Now listen very carefully. Proposed to be proved is one which is admissible only on the proof of some other fact. It will seem a little trickish, but it is not. If a fact proposed to be proved by one is admissible only upon the proof of some other fact, then how to prove both? Then how to prove both of them? And which one is to be proved first? I'll just give you an example. If you've ever read about the provisions of section 65 and 66, the primary evidence and the secondary evidence, documents are always to be proved by way of primary evidence. Somebody has lost evidence. Say there was a title deed. Say there was a mortgage deed, and he has lost the original. What does he do? Evidence Act says that you can prove it by way of secondary evidence also. Then, but the Evidence Act says that if you want to prove this document by way of secondary evidence may be a photocopy or something, you must have to prove two things. First, you have to prove that the primary evidence existed. You will have to prove to the court that the original existed. And then you will have to prove to the court that how you lost that original. Right? Now, these two things that I'm talking about, that is the second part. If the fact proposed to be proved, what is the fact proposed to be proved? The sale deed which I have lost. That is the fact which I want to prove, that look, this is my title deed. I was the owner. That I have lost. Is a one which is admissible only on the proof of some other. What is the proof of the other thing is that one, the original existed, two, I've lost it. So the court will decide if it allows you to prove it in what manner. Should you prove the first two things first and then the second? This is for the court to decide. Sometimes the court allows you to give secondary evidence but reserves the proof of the first part. That you can give an evidence with respect to the secondary evidence of the document. However, at the end of the trial, I'll also see if you've been able to prove the other fact, that you had the original with you and that you lost the original. Now, the second part of this section. If the relevancy of the fact depends upon the prior proof of another. First thing was if the fact proposed to be proved. Second thing is if the relevancy of the fact depends upon the prior proof of another. What is the relevancy of the fact? I'll just give you an example. Let me just complete my question. If one relevancy of fact depends upon the prior proof of another, can the judge permit the evidence of the first fact before the second is proved? Or can the judge permit the evidence of the second fact before the first is proved? Suppose somebody is charged of having he's charged for being in possession of stolen property. To be in possession of stolen property. Of that stolen property. Now here, it depends on the judge whether he wants the prosecution to prove the first thing, that this property is stolen, or the second thing, possession of such and such property, right? So the judge can always have a discretion to decide the admissibility of the evidence in what fashion, in what order. That is 136. Now let us go to 137. It simply says what is examination in chief, what is cross-examination, what is re-examination. The examination of a witness by a party who calls him is called examination in chief. The examination of a witness by the adverse party is called as cross-examination. And the examination of the witness subsequent to the cross-examination by the party who has called him shall be called re-examination. Ordinarily, as a matter of practice in the courts, re-examination only with the permission of the court. 138. What is the order of examination? How will we examine the witnesses? Of course, first examination in chief, a witness is called, then is cross-examination, and then the re-examination. I'll tell you something, that how the re-examination is to be done. If some new material has come forward in the cross-examination, some new fact, some new material which was earlier not on the record, then a witness might be recalled to explain that, and then in those circumstances the re-examination is allowed. 139. Does the person stepping in witness box stepping in witness box just to prove a document become a witness? क्या विटनेस बॉक्स में आया हुआ कोई भी शख्स विटनेस कहलाएगा अगर वो सिर्फ डॉक्यूमेंट ही सरेंडर करने आया है? I'll refer to the case law of Parmeshwari Devi's case in 1976 Supreme Court. Now, what happened in that case? There was a partnership deed. There was a partnership, and certain partners were retired by way of a dissolution deed, and some people chose to file complaint against some partners under 420, 465, 467 IPC. Sounding order was passed, and later on, it appeared to the prosecution that the dissolution deed, by way of which the partnership deed was dissolved, was a very important document, but it was in the hands of a widow who was not a party to these proceedings. The widow, namely Parmeshwari Devi, sent a written intimation to the court through her advocate that she is not in possession of any such dissolution deed. She is a pardanashing lady, and therefore she be exempted from appearing before the court. The court thereafter passed an order requiring her presence before the court, and also passing an order, if need be, the court will examine you on oath and may ask certain questions from Parmeshwari Devi. This order was challenged in the revision before the Court of Sessions, and then ultimately it went to the Supreme Court. Now, what did the Supreme Court say? The Supreme Court said that the application was moved probably under Section 94 CRPC for a person to produce a document, and the person was not a party to the proceeding. The Supreme Court also held that warrants could have been issued under Section 96 or under Section 98 CRPC. Even the house of Shrimati Parmeshwari Devi could have been allowed to be searched in order to reveal whether she was in possession of the dissolution deed, but the trial court had exceeded its jurisdiction by passing such an order that she needs to be called before the court and she needs to give a statement on oath requiring the satisfaction of the court that she is not in possession of such document. Supreme Court has here referred to Section 139, saying that a person who's not a party to any proceeding cannot be compelled to become a witness. He cannot be cross-examined, cannot be examined on oath in such circumstances. 140. The question: can a witness to character be cross-examined and re-examined? Yes, a witness to character can be cross-examined and re-examined. 141. What is the leading question? A question suggesting the answer. That is a leading question. 142. When the leading question must not be asked, the answer is in examination in chief. You must not ask a leading question, otherwise the defense will pounce at you. Immediately they come. This is a leading question, sir, you can't ask this. Now, usually when they examine the witnesses, they ask certain things like, so what happened on that day? But nobody can ask a leading question in the shape like, on 12th of April 2012, were you present at such and such place and saw Mr. So-and-so attacking Mr. So-and-so in front of you? This will be a leading question. Now, 144. What are the rules with respect to matters in writing? You all know that oral evidence of documents is not permissible under the Evidence Act, Section 91, you all know. Now, what are the rules with respect to matters in writing? Suppose a witness comes to the witness box and he has written something in his own writing. Can a witness depose regarding the contents of a contract, a grant, or a disposition? Can he? A contract is a document in writing, but can a witness say something about it? Yes, he can. If the court thinks that such evidence ought to be produced. Now, the next question is, if you are the defense counsel, can the adverse party object to such evidence? We usually do. When some people are speaking about a document and that document is not in his hands, as a defense counsel, it is my foremost duty to take an objection then and there. Sir, I take a strong objection to this. Please let him produce this document. So the trial court will say the cross-examination of this case is deferred and the witness is directed to produce the contract dated so and so, so and so, so and so on the next date of hearing. So the question is, can you object? Yes. Or else you can take an objection, either he proves this or else such facts have been proved which entitle a party to give secondary evidence. If the document itself had been lost, obviously then primary evidence is not possible. Then he will have to prove that the document was lost in such and such thing. The onus will shift on that part. Can a witness be cross-examined without previous statements in writing, without showing him such writing? Now 145 is a very important section, very useful in the criminal trials. Can you cross-examine a person without showing him his writing? Yes, you can. Next question. When will you have to show him the writing? When you have to contradict him. If you want to contradict a witness that, look here, this is what you had said earlier, this is your statement in writing, then you will have to draw the attention of that witness to that very part. We usually practice this in the criminal trials. In the criminal trials, there's a statement under 161 CRPC. It's a part of the challan. The defense counsel will go through the entire statement that he has made, that's been made a part of challan. Now, when this witness comes and appears and gives his statement, which is called examination in chief, we would try to contradict him. That, did you say to the police that such and such thing happened in this fashion? He will say, oh, probably no. Then I'll ask him, then I'll put that statement before him and say, kindly read these lines, you've said this. He said, yes, I might have. So then the cross-examination goes, the attention of the witness is drawn from mark A to mark B on the document exhibit so and so wherein it is so stated. This is all done to contradict the witness. I'll sum up in the end that why we contradict the witnesses. Now, 146. Which questions can be lawfully asked in cross-examination? Which questions can you lawfully ask him? This is a very ticklish thing, comes to most lawyers with practice. But Evidence Act will give you some kind of guidance as to what are the nature of the questions which you can ask and what you cannot. If an objection is taken at the trial that, sir, he cannot ask this question, you have to refer to this section. This section will tell you that there are basically three kinds of questions that you can ask him. The intention of that question is 1, to test his veracity, 2, to discover who he is and what is his position in life. आप क्या काम करते हैं, आपकी उम्र क्या है, आपका designation क्या है department में, what is he doing, what is his position in life, to test his veracity, truthfulness. 3rd, to shake his credit by injuring his character. to shake his credit by injuring his character. Now, are there any exceptions? Yes. You all know what are the exceptions. In rape cases, you can't injure a character's across the character of the prosecutrix to say that she was an immoral woman and therefore her credibility is shaken. So that is one exception. So 147, the question is, when is a witness compelled to answer? Any question that relates to the matter relevant to the suit or proceeding. Now, for this very reason, relevant questions, well, the court can always report the circumstances of the case to High Court or the higher authority to which the pleader is subordinate. You know the institution to which all of us are subordinate, that is the Bar Council or the Bar Association. In the case of the lawyers, it's the Bar Council. Can the court forbid asking indecent and scandalous questions? Yes, the court can forbid you from asking indecent and scandalous questions unless, of course, when they relate to the fact and issue. Can the court forbid questions intended to insult or annoy? As a matter of practice in the trial courts, I've seen many times the lawyers take undue advantage somebody's weak background or say criminal background. Sometimes due advantage and sometimes undue advantage. When it's undue, it is usually to be called, the bluff is to be called out under section 151 and 152. There's something called I often tell my students, there's something called good boy, bad boy section. I don't know how many students would recall that. Good boy, bad boy sections. Section 53 and 54. I always say good boy, bad boy section. That the past good conduct is relevant, but the past bad conduct is not relevant. So Evidence Act has very good rules, very nice rules to guide all of you when you are holding the trials. If you are dealing with if the court is dealing with an accused, and the accused is say a history cheater, he's been involved in so many crimes in the past, still the prosecution will have to prove his new offense for which he's being tried. His past bad record is irrelevant, but his past good record is always relevant. So these are the two good boy, bad boy sections, 53 and 54. Now, I would invite all of your attention towards the case Mr. Arun Jaitley and Arvind Kejriwal, the present CM of Delhi. They were engaged in a very nasty battle of defamation suit, where there was a suggestion given in the cross-examination. Crook. The word used was crook and criminal, crooked. These words were not taken to very nicely by Mr. Arun Jaitley, who filed a petition before the Delhi High Court. And the Delhi High Court questioned the senior advocate who had cross-examined him and asked him that who had given you these instructions to call him a crook in your cross-examination. And he says, I was instructed by my instructing counsel. And when the instructing counsel was asked, we were asked by the client. So they called upon Mr. Arvind Kejriwal to file an affidavit as to whether he had instructed his lawyers. Mr. Arvind Kejriwal filed an affidavit that he never ever used these words and never suggested his lawyers to use these words while conducting the cross-examination. However, the matter ended because there was an unconditional apology tendered and those words were deleted. So the court can disallow these words which are scandalous, indecent, intended to insult, 151, 152, right? So, when a witness denies any charge Under 153, I'm asking a question that when a witness denies any charge, imputation over his character, can you contradict him by giving an evidence? आपने किसी विटनेस को के ऊपर कोई लांछन लगाई और उसने वो डिनाई कर दी है, क्या आप उसको कॉन्ट्राडिक्ट करने के लिए कोई एविडेंस दे सकते हैं? 153 says no, you can't, and there is a reason. The reason is that the framers of the Evidence Act did not want that the trial should go. Okay, I have received a message that some people want me to talk about the hostile witnesses. Okay, we will talk about the hostile witnesses also. So the thing is, in fact, one of the cases that I was going to discuss had this proposition about hostile witnesses and their effect. We will come to that later in some time. So the witness, if he denies that, you can't go beyond the trial, beyond the subject which is being tried, and you cannot contradict the witness. But there are two exceptions. Are there any exceptions? Yes, there are two exceptions. What are those two exceptions? If this witness has been a subject of prior conviction, then you can contradict him. How? You can simply confront him with a judgment of his conviction. Number one. Number two, question with respect to impeaching his impartiality. No, this is a very important subsection. Second subsection exception is that the question with respect to his impartiality, he can be always questioned with respect to, or he can be confronted with such things. Otherwise, you generally can't contradict what, if you have leveled any allegation, he says he denies it, you can't contradict it, except these two exceptions. Now, 154. Can you question your own witness? क्या आप अपने ही witness को सवाल कर सकते हैं? Yes, you can. Now, I will come to that, the situation where somebody was asking about the hostile witnesses. This question of hostile witness, this term hostile witness has not been defined anywhere in the Evidence Act, and it has not been used. The term has not been used. 154 allows you to question your own witness. The court may, in its discretion, permit the person who calls a witness. Discretion lies with the court, of course, that he may ask him any questions which might have been put by the adverse party in cross-examination. Usually this would happen in all the cases where the witnesses turn hostile. What happens? Many cases which are not compoundable under section 320 of CRPC. Most of the offences which are compoundable offences, they are allowed to be compounded under section 320. And many of the offences which are non-compoundable, they are now allowed to be quashed under the exercise of the extraordinary jurisdiction by the High Court after the judgment of Punjab and Haryana High Court in Kulwinder Singh versus State of Punjab. In the judgment reported in 2009, RCR criminal, page number is 1059. This was the first judgment which Punjab and Haryana High Court under Justice Suryakant had passed a judgment where Justice Suryakant rightly recognized that most of the criminal trials where some non-compoundable offences are involved, the witnesses come to the witness box, they turn hostile, and it wastes very precious time of the trial courts. And if the parties have compromised, and if the offences are not against the public, and if they are not very heinous crimes, then those offences could very well be allowed to be compounded by the High Court in the exercise of the extraordinary jurisdiction which vests under them under section 482 CRPC. Now, this judgment was affirmed by the Honorable Supreme Court earlier in the matrimonial cases only, in B.S. Joshi's case, 2003-4 somewhere, and later on, the judgment of Punjab and Haryana High Court rendered in Kulvinder Singh's case in 2007 was affirmed by the Supreme Court in Gyan Singh versus State of Punjab in 2013 something. So in 2013, the Honorable Supreme Court said yes, can be allowed, but offences against public should not be allowed to be compounded by the High Court. One. Secondly, serious and heinous crimes like highway robbery, rape cases, murder cases, all these cases you should not. Now what happens? In most of these cases where there are heinous cases, the parties have compromised. The witnesses would simply come in to the witness box and say that we never signed on these papers. Nobody gave any information to the police. Our statement was never recorded. This and that. Now, an amendment came in the year 2006 which says that nothing in this section shall entitle the person so permitted under subsection 1 to rely on any part of the evidence of such witnesses. This means that the court could now convict the accused on the evidence of the hostile witnesses. I have the experience to deal with one of the cases from district Amritsar, wherein we had filed an appeal under a rape and a murder case, and all the witnesses had turned hostile in that case, except that one of the witnesses who had turned hostile had admitted one stray thing in his cross-examination. I would not go deep into the very deep into the matter, but I would only say that this was a case where a prosecutrix herself had supported the accused, saying that they are not the ones who had committed the offense. The real offenders have been let off by the police. Still, I think by virtue of this amendment to section 154, the evidence of one of the hostile witnesses was relied upon. Now, hostile witnesses have their testimony has to some extent been allowed, and what circumstances it was allowed, I'll tell you. That most part of the evidence of that witness was denying his earlier stance taken before the police, but he admitted having signed on one of his statements rendered before the police, which the court considered to be sufficient in addition to the evidence given by the official witnesses, and therefore the accused was handed over a life sentence in that case. Now, coming to section 155, how can you impeach the credit of the witness? How can you impeach the credit? You have just seen a video clipping whereby the credit of the witness was sought to be impeached by exposing him. You can do so in the trial courts by way of three things. One is that you adduce the evidence of the person who testifies, who gives a statement that from their knowledge, who testify from their knowledge that it is the evidence of such person wants to whose credit he wants to impeach is unworthy of credit, number one. Number two, the proof that witness has been bribed, and number three, that by proof of his former inconsistent statements. Now, the former inconsistent statements, you will find it elsewhere also. I will keep on referring to those sections. I'll keep on referring and rejoining these sections again and again. I will also come to a judgment talking about 155 and 157. Let me just sum up these three sections little quickly. Which questions can be put to a witness who comes to give evidence of corroboration of any relevant fact? So, suppose a witness comes to a witness box to give corroboration of any relevant fact. He may be asked any question as to other relevant fact which occurred if the court thinks fit would corroborate the testimony of the witness as to relevant fact that he testifies. So the example is that suppose somebody is an accomplice in a robbery, and he narrates that what happened before the robbery, how they prepared for it, how they went about the business, and when to perform that thing, they went to commit that crime. The things happened before and after that. They are all relevant facts which are connecting the main crime with the with something relevant in the proceeding. So all those questions can be put to the witness. Number 156 and now 157. Can a formal statement made by a witness made before any authority legally competent to investigate the matter be proved? क्या अगर किसी विटनेस ने आज से पहले किसी और अथॉरिटी के आगे इन राइटिंग स्टेटमेंट दी है, क्या वो प्रूव की जा सकती है? जी हाँ, की जा सकती है. किस चीज के लिए? To corroborate and to contradict. I remember a very famous case in my early days of practice where boy and girl had eloped. A young boy and girl had eloped, and when they wished to come back after marrying, about 6 months thereafter, they wished to come back. They met the lawyer and they said, okay, now we have made peace, and we believe that our families might have made peace with each other, and therefore we want to go back. The lawyer was smart and he said, he was quite experienced. He said, I won't allow you to go back. First, you can go and get your statement recorded before an executive magistrate. A statement was recorded that this happened, that happened. We eloped. Yes, I went on my own, and our parents tried to harm us, so we left the place and we shifted somewhere else. So as soon as the girl went to her place, very soon thereafter she was brainwashed, and an FIR under section 366 376 IPC was registered against the boy and his entire family. And it was this statement made earlier in time in writing before an executive magistrate, which is actually responsible to help exonerate all these accused people in that false FIR which was registered against them, because it was not a case of any kidnapping or rape charges as alleged to be. 158. What matters may be proved in connection with proved statement relevant under section 32 or 33. 32, you all know, the dying declaration. 33, all the statements between all the statements between the similar parties before between the same parties as to the same matters, relevant matters. So all these matters can be they can be proved in order to contradict or corroborate. The two words I'm using time and again is contradict or corroborate. Either it is the same statement, in that case it is a corroboration, or it's a different statement, in that case it's a contradiction. 159. Can a witness refresh his memory? How? Most of my students who would have read this provision of law, and even the lawyers, would say that we've never seen this section being used anywhere, but I'll tell you how important this is. Yes, by referring to any writing made by himself at the time of transaction, he can refresh his memory, or by writing made by any other person and read by the witness within the time aforesaid. Now, there are two things. Can a witness refresh his memory, and how? Yes, he can, by referring to a writing. Two, how refer to a copy. He can refer to a copy of such writing before the court. And then there's 160. 159 talks about the witness. He's giving an oral evidence. Can he refresh his memory? Suppose a Munshi ji has come, and those Munshis who keep the accounts, Bahi Khatas, he did an entry on such and such day, but he doesn't exactly recall that what was the amount, what was the date. He can refer to his Bahi Khata in any case. Now he's called a bookkeeper, and he can say orally that I have been maintaining this book in the due course of business. Most of my friends who are from the income tax background, they will understand this word very nicely. Due course of business. Books are to be kept in the due course of business, and I can imagine them smiling over the screen right now. So the first thing about the oral evidence. The second is about when the witness says something about the document itself. I'll just tell you a case now. A case happened in Rajasthan High Court, where all the witnesses had turned hostile, and the the sentence was passed in that case only on the ground that this there was a confessional statement under Section 27 of the Evidence Act. Now, all of you know that under Section 27 of the Evidence Act, when a confessional statement is rendered in the custody, then some material is discovered in consequence to such confessional statement, then those statements can be relied to that extent. You all know that. Now, in this case, he the witness, the investigating officer, had stated that he had made a recovery in consequence of a statement suffered by on behalf of the accused under Section 27, and he relied upon that statement and that recovery. And the Rajasthan High Court was holding that the statement of PW8 shows that he did not specifically narrate before the court as to what exactly the accused appellant stated to him while giving the information under Section 27. Why do you think the court would have said that what specifically he had narrated to him? How could he remember the exact words? What the accused might have stated to him in the custody? The direct implication of Section 59 and 60 is that a witness who steps into the witness box for proving a fact, who has seen or observed, must give oral evidence to prove such a fact. Actually, the court wanted that this witness should have proved he was giving oral evidence, but he had to prove that statement which he had made. They say that how could he prove that statement? Most of the witnesses had turned hostile. The IO did not have anything. This was a case where the court expounded Section 159 and 160. The court said he could have referred to that document, which is the confessional statement, refreshed his memory, and then narrated what he had seen in that document right over there. The information memo, Exhibit P/32, which bears a narrative of the statement given by the accused appellant to the investigating officer, cannot be construed to be a substantive piece of evidence. That memo, information memo, the statement under Section 27 cannot be construed as a substantive piece of evidence. They said this is not admissible in evidence. Therefore, it was imperative for the investigating officer who stepped into the witness box to have refreshed his memory, see the contents of that, and thereafter give evidence as per Section 160. Thereafter, say that what were the contents of that document and how he had made recovery under those sections. Therefore, this judgment was overturned. This could not sustain. That is how important these provisions are. I am only sensitizing, trying to induce a deep sense of quest for knowledge and an eagerness into all the students of law to deeply go into these sections and then appreciate and reappreciate, because they are very interesting. From these questions, you will get hints that what are they actually trying to say. 161. What is the right of the adverse party now as to writing used to refresh memory? Writing must be shown to the adverse party. Now, somebody came, refreshed his memory, and then he gave evidence with respect to the document with which he has, yes, Jaya, I can read your message that some audiences have queries, but let me just finish these 4-5 sections and we are done, and then I'll definitely take all of your questions. The adverse party has to be shown, and then they have to be allowed the right of cross-examination of these very sections, right? About this very document. Now, production of documents, the provision is in 162, but the question that I've framed is, what is a witness who has been summoned to produce a document supposed to do? Bhai, if some witness has come to the court to produce a document, what is he supposed to do? He shall bring the document to the court. Very obvious. And what happens if there is objection? If there is an objection to it, it shall be decided by the court. What does the court do? The court inspects the record. This is all 162. And what happens if the objection is taken with respect to language? If the objection is taken with respect to language, the court can always order the translation of that document. This is the purport of 162. Now, what is 163? I have framed it in a different way. Just listen to it. A gives notice to B to bring a document to the court. B brings the document. A inspects it. B is bound to give it in evidence if A requires him to do so. So this is the import of section 163. The practical aspect I will discuss with you. Usually, if somebody is asked that, did you show this transaction in your bank account, in your income tax return, mostly in the proceedings under 138 Negotiable Instruments Act, we usually ask this question, that did you show this transaction in your income tax account? And if he says yes, kindly bring that document. The cross-examination is adjourned, the case is adjourned, the cross-examination is postponed, and the witness comes. If on the next date the lawyer will see that he has a little statement in his hand, he will not ask him the same question. Why? Because the document will go against his case. If he sees that he doesn't have anything in his hands, then he will ask him a question very boldly. Yes, bring that. Did you bring the document? Did you bring your income tax return? He will say, no, I'm sorry, I was not able to bring. Then this adverse inference will be taken against that party, that witness. The 164, can a party use the same document which it refused to produce when called upon to do so? This happened in one of my civil cases. See, there was a power of attorney which was forged, and we moved an application that the other party be directed to produce a document. The other party be directed to produce a document, this alleged forged power of attorney. They said, sorry, we've lost it. Then the court, exercising its due discretion and power under 164, said, now you cannot rely. They were restrained from relying upon that document in any stage of the case. This is 164. Once you say that you can't produce, then you can't produce it later also to your own benefit. Now, 165. My questions which will help you understand 165. Can a judge ask a question to any witness? Yes. Can he order production of a document or a thing? Yes. Can a party take objection to the question asked by a judge? No. Can a party cross-examine a witness upon any answer given in reply to any such question asked by the judge? No. However, the section says that the judgment must be based on facts relevant under the Evidence Act, and it must be based on the facts duly proved. Another question. This is very important. I told you that I'll come back to section 121 to 131. This is very important. Can a judge compel to answer a question which witness could otherwise refuse to answer under section 121 to 131? I told you that these are the privileges. Now, to what extent these privileges are applicable? Can a judge compel somebody to answer these questions? No. Can a judge ask improper questions under 148, 149? Improper questions as we read under 148, 149? No. Can he dispense with the primary evidence of a document? No. Why? Because the Evidence Act says that it cannot be dispensed with. Right. So this is overall all about the witnesses, how the witnesses are to be examined, in what questions are to be asked, what questions cannot be asked, what are the discretionary powers of the court to adjudicate upon any question which directly doesn't deal with the issue in question, and how these are to be exercised, and what questions are to be avoided, how a witness and his credibility can be impeached. And yes, I'll share with you one or two judgments. One is the judgment by a single bench of Punjab Haryana High Court, 2009, Volume 4, RCR Criminal, pages 762. This is Lior Avi Ben Moel versus Narcotic Control Bureau. Now, what happened in this case? An FIR under the NDPS Act was registered. A huge quantity of charas, about 200 something kgs, 36 kgs of charas was recovered from an Italian national, and the officer concerned, who was one of the witnesses, had actually tried to ask for bribe in that case, and subsequent to the registration of the FIR under NDPS Act, that officer was caught taking bribe from the brother of one of the accused in this case. Now, they had taped the entire version, video, clipping, audio. They produced it before the trial court. They cross-examined this officer that, look, that is your video. This is you asking for bribe. And the officer obviously denied that it was his voice. He said it is manufactured, this, that. Then the prosecution filed an application to record the voice samples of the accused as well as the officer concerned, who was accused in the other FIR, and he was a witness. But that application was declined, and it was taken to the High Court, and it was argued that this application must be allowed in view of Section 155 and 146 because it seeks to impeach the credibility of this witness on the ground of impartiality. Remember that word? Impartiality. Now, another judgment that I wanted to discuss with you was with respect to the immunity provided under 132 to the witnesses. In one of such cases, the facts was, this is the last case, I'm wrapping it off now. In that case, somebody by the name of Karuna gave an offer to a person who is referred to as PW64 in the judgment. An offer was given that he will give him 5 lakh rupees if he killed Vijayan. Now this man, PW64, took 50,000, he agreed. He took 50,000 rupees in advance, and he engages another man to get the work done, offers him 10,000 at the spot with some payment to be made later on. But after some time, this man PW64 develops cold feet and he resigns, he withdraws. He doesn't get in touch with the main accused who was getting the killing done, Karuna. But after some time, he read in the newspapers that the man who was supposed to be killed has been killed, and has been killed by the same man whom he was engaging. When he called that man, he said, yes, I had got in direct contact with Karuna and I have killed him and taken 4 lakhs from Karuna. Now what happened? This man stepped into the witness box as the 64th witness in the 65 witnesses which were adduced in that murder case. The prosecution moved an application under 319 CRPC to summon this man as an additional accused because he was also part of the conspiracy. The High Court dismissed the application. The trial court dismissed the application. The revision was dismissed by the High Court, saying that he has the immunity because the witness who is compelled to answer any question which may criminate him, as we saw in that section there, he will not be allowed to be prosecuted. But the High Court also observed that if there is any other independent material apart from this, then he could have been carried as an accused. However, the Supreme Court gave a different view. The Supreme Court gave slightly different view, said that this person could not have been adduced as a witness at all without having resorted to the procedure under Section 307 CRPC, granting him pardon, giving him the status of an approver, and only thereafter he could have been examined, because the scope of Section 132 of the Evidence Act, Article 20, Subclause 2 of the Constitution of India have completely made him immune. And then the Supreme Court, while directing that he be granted pardon under Section 307 CRPC, will record his evidence afresh, because nobody who's an accused of an offense would be able to step in the witness box on behalf of the prosecution without being an approver. So that is all for now, and I will invite all your questions one by one, please. I cannot see anybody on my screen. Actually, it would have been nice to see all of you on my screen. Yes, Jaya, please come ahead.
So the first question is that if a witness turns hostile and after some time he gives a statement in the court, and when he's called upon the examination again, then he again turns hostile, then will the statement given by such person will be admissible or not?
Say once again, please.
So the question is that if a witness turns hostile at the initial stage and gives a statement and he gets his statement recorded, and when he's been further called for examination, he turns hostile again. Will the statement given by the witness is admissible or not?
There's a presupposition in the question that a witness has been recalled. The first thing is that a witness, once declared hostile, would be can be cross-examined by the party calling him under Section 154. In any case, this witness would be cross-examined by the other party also. He would thereafter, usually opportunities don't, the occasions don't arise that such witnesses are called to the witness box again. But this has happened in one of the cases recently. I think this was in this Babaram Rahim's case only, where this Khadak Singh approached the Honorable High Court that he had turned hostile because of such and such reasons. And after the High Court's interference, his evidence was allowed to be recorded again. Now, your question goes a little beyond that to say that this witness has turned hostile yet again. And if this witness has turned hostile yet again, would his evidence be admissible or not? Kindly look into Section 154, Subclause 2, which says that nothing is in this section shall disentitle the person so permitted under subsection 1 to rely on any part of the evidence of such witness. Means that the prosecution can still rely upon some parts of the evidence which this hostile, 2 times hostile witness might have given. Still they can rely upon it. No problem with that. Yes.
So the next question is there any prescribed guidelines regarding the situations in which a conviction can be made on the basis of hostile witnesses' statement?
Prescribed guidelines, yes, there are many Supreme Court judgments dealing with the hostile witnesses. Now, after this 2006 amendment, the judgments are more actually kind of an aid to the prosecution than to the defense, because the problem of hostile witnesses has been afflicting the Indian courts from centuries now, if not centuries, then decades now. Now, the court has always faced this problem that due to this weak witness protection system in our society, and the witnesses do not come forward really to support the case of the prosecution. The conviction rate was very less, and many people would just go scot-free on account of the non-adherence of the witnesses to their earlier statements. They were often, the accused were often taking benefit from the loopholes which the system has created, not the procedural law, not the Indian Evidence Act. Be sure about that. But the system was such that the witnesses were not adhering to their earlier statements. The Supreme Court said, yes, And especially after the incorporation of this amendment, which has come into effect from 16th of April 2006, that is to subclause 2 under section 154. Yes, the Supreme Court now says that certain statements can be read. I'll just repeat once again that case which I was discussing with you here. In that case, one of the witnesses was actually the accused named by the prosecutrix. This might sound a little bit paradoxical to you, but the prosecutrix had pointed out her fingers to one of the persons who was cited as a witness by the prosecution, by the prosecuting agency. There was a stray statement. He had also been hostile. Now, if this witness had not been hostile, then it would have been very obvious that look, wrong people have been arrayed as accused. Only he has supported the entire version, and all the other witnesses are on the one hand, and this person might have been singled out. And why is he supporting the prosecution version when even the prosecutrix has not supported it? Because she was the one who was subjected to gang rape. Now, another person was killed. There was a murder. Now, this witness, very conveniently, he gave the entire statement and disowned the entire earlier statements, saying that no, I did not give this, I did not give that. But very cleverly, he admitted 2 or 3 things and documents. Yes, I signed these documents, and those documents, that part of the statement was considered sufficient for the court to award life sentence to the accused in that case. I would say that maybe the legislation has tried a smart thing by introducing this subsection, but as a defense counsel, as somebody who's always stood for the defense, I will say that the contrivers, the criminals, are very smart. They sometimes even outdo the provisions of law, and they are mostly given these hints by the legal minds as how to get the benefit out of these. And sometimes when an innocent person is convicted on account of these loopholes, it really is very, very painful. But then Supreme Court has given directions, yes, that giving the low rate of convictions. Yes, please, your next question.
So the third question is, will a conversation between a couple
Please repeat the question. You were inaudible for some time.
So my question is, will a conversation between a couple who lives like husband and wife in a live-in relationship is covered under the privileged communication under evidence?
Yes, good question. In the changing circumstances, people who have been living in live-in relationships, the very definition of section 122, the very wording of the section says no person who is or has been married. I will stop only there. These communications are only applicable to the people who are married. There's another aspect to that. That aspect is if whether these two persons have been living together for a long time, 1, and 2, whether they have been behaving as husband and wife, 3, whether society has been taking them as husband and wife, whether they have children out of that relationship. There it becomes a little complicated. Otherwise, it's very clear that without marriage, they might not be able to seek that protection under 122. Strictly speaking, only the married couples. Strictly speaking, only those who are in contract of marriage. Yes, Jaya, next question.
So I think we have covered all of our questions, and you have very well covered all the aspects of examination of witnesses, and you have made the concepts even more clear with the help of various case laws, and you have almost covered all the sections which were dealing with examination of witness. So at last, I would like to conclude the session by saying that, sir, it was an immense pleasure for us that you joined the webinar and bestowed us by being guest of honor. Your precious time was of great importance for us, Your involvement and interest towards our team is a great support, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I would also like to thank the team of Lawyers Gyan for collaborating with us and Rishabh Srivastava for making this event successful. Sir, if you like to say something.
Yes, thank you so much. I think I would consider my session as successful if it is able to generate a little bit of interest to know more about the Indian Evidence Act, because these are the principles, these are the provisions which are actually helpful to all the lawyers, irrespective of the forum, irrespective of the court, whether it's trial court, the Mofussil courts, or the higher courts, the High Court or the Supreme Court. Wherever they go, the appeals, the evidence, everywhere there's a question of law, the reappreciation of evidence. It will require all of you to use these provisions as a SIF and to appreciate the provisions very nicely, and to be able to bring the question of law before the court concerned, and to be able to contest the cases of your clients, of your future clients, in a more appropriate manner and in a more effective manner. I think all of us will have to just keep on discussing these provisions again and again. Thank you so much, everybody, for bearing with me. It took a little longer than it was supposed to be. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.